But I am going to go back to the budget speech for today, the midterm budget speech. And let's bring in someone who I'm sure was listening very keenly, Chris Yelland, energy analyst, about what the finance minister had to say. Good to have you back with us as well. Shall we talk about the power or the debt first? Let's talk about debt, shall we, for a moment. So government going to take over... Government going to take over a significant portion of Eskom's debt. Good news, bad news?
Well, it's good news in the sense that they've announced something, and that at least starts a process. But they've been talking about this for a couple of years now, and I found it disappointing that there was not even finalization on the quantum. They just left that open-ended, something like between a third to two-thirds of Eskom's debt will be taken over by the sovereign, transferred to the sovereign balance sheet. So no detail on the quantum and no detail on the timing. And for me, that's disappointing after so long. But I am hearing that behind the scenes, the detail is still being worked out with investors, and will probably come, in roadshows with investors going forward. So for me, still a lot of uncertainty, and I would have hoped that these things would have been finalized by now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know there isn't much detail, and as you say, we're going to have these road shows. We know later that many journalists will have a chance to get more detail, just dig into the minutiae of the speech. But I was hearing that this quantum you're talking about, anywhere between one-third and two-thirds of Eskom's debt. What would it mean if government were to take on that debt? My understanding, Chris, is that it will allow them to free up money, for example, maintenance, which is what you and I talk about all the time.
Well, look, first of all, to say, this restructuring of the Eskom's debt and taking, that's been taken over by government doesn't change the fact, that the debt still remains. And remember, government owns 100% of Eskom, and government has guaranteed a significant portion of this debt. So whether the debt sits in Eskom or sits in government doesn't make that much difference. But it does improve Eskom's standalone balance sheet and enables it to perhaps borrow more on its balance sheet, and it's currently, it can't borrow more because it's the cost of Eskom debt is now too high. So government taking this over may mean a somewhat slight reduction in the cost of servicing this debt. Because Eskom's credit rating is lower than the sovereign. So it may result in some debt service cost savings going forward, but the debt still remains, it still has to be serviced, and it still has to be paid back. But it does improve Eskom's balance sheet.
It certainly would. Anything that can improve Eskom's balance sheet right now will actually make a big difference. Chris, let's just talk for a second, if we can, about the load shedding itself as well. So now we have to start getting into the granular of some of the plans here. The removal of the licensing threshold for generation projects representing over 9,000 megawatts of capacity. Just before we talk about licensing and thresholds, etc., just remind me, if these licensing thresholds were removed, what would 9,000 megawatts mean for South Africa? Is it Gauteng, is it the Western Cape, or is it Randburg?
No, this will free up really the ability of large industry. That means mines and Sasol and large industry to be able to deploy large-scale renewable energy quicker than it would otherwise if one would have to have a licensing process, or if one would have to rely on the public procurement processes, which are time-consuming and cumbersome. So I think it's freeing this up, it's removing some of the red tape that is unnecessary, and it will hopefully speed things up. But I don't think you must think that there's 9,000 megawatts coming on quickly. By quickly, I'm talking in the next 2 years. Those procurements are big procurements. They still have to happen. They are starting to happen, and they could be starting to happen. In fact, they are starting to happen at greater pace. So if you look at the applications for generation registration with NERSA. So you don't need a license, but you need to register your project with NERSA, and there is a certain amount of red tape with Eskom or municipalities before you can do that. You can see a really significant increase in the number of registrations of projects that are on the table and are going to go forward. But it's going to take some time before those get connected to the grid. My concern is that I'm not seeing the kind of effort in the solar rooftop PV and battery storage markets at domestic and commercial level, which can make a difference very much quicker. These are smaller installations, but there are lots of them. So if one can facilitate that, make it quicker, it can make a big difference quickly.
I think that's what everybody would like as well, obviously, Chris. Last question to you. It's a double-barreled question. I know you don't mind me asking these, Chris, but we could talk about Eskom all day. One, what we weren't hearing, what some politicians and critics were saying is they wanted to hear the word nationalization. I didn't hear that. What I did hear, though, is reducing South Africa's reliance on a single monopoly utility. Is that the way forward in your mind?
No, and I think government is sending the message that the future of the generation sector in South Africa is going to be a diversified and competitive generation sector where Eskom is not a monopoly, where the private sector will have a role to play. That is not to say that Eskom is going to suddenly disappear. It's always going to be, and it's going to continue to be going forward, a big part of the generation sector, but it's not going to be the only one. So I think we're seeing now, a diversification of generation technologies and a diversification in the generators themselves, away from the Eskom monopoly and away from this heavily overdependence on coal. And that, I think, is a good thing, and I think government is committed to that.